On a June night in 1997, Kathy Peters was asleep at her home in Mirror Lake, a quiet neighborhood of Sarasota, Florida. Around 3, Audrey was startled awake by a strange noise. It was unlike anything Kathy had heard, a faint, eerie, rattling hiss. After a few seconds, the sound faded and Kathy tried to go back to sleep, but now she was too anxious. So she got up and crossed to the window. She opened the blinds and looked across the lake's glassy surface. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but then she nearly jumped out of her skin when a loud, metallic banging noise sounded right below her window. Somebody was pounding on her screen, or Kathy ran downstairs, having no idea who could be bothering her at this time of the night. She considered not answering, but Mirror Lake was a very safe community, so there had to be a reasonable explanation here. So she opened the door. Through the screen, she could see someone standing in the darkness. Kathy asked who it was and what they wanted, but the figure didn't say anything. Now Kathy was terrified, so she switched on the porch light. And when she saw what was in front of her, she reeled back in horror. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please remember, before you do anything mean to the follow button, walk a mile in their shoes. That way, when you bully them, you're a mile away and you have their shoes. Okay, let's get into today's story. June 20th, 1997 started out as a perfect day for Henry Caneva. The weary, silver-mustached 76-year-old arrived at the Toyota dealership in Sarasota shortly after dawn. Getting to work early meant that he got first pick of the morning customers, which was how he liked it. By lunch, he'd already made to sales, and he was working on his third. And when that third customer signed for her car, Henry handed her the keys and felt that familiar rush of victory. He'd worked plenty of jobs throughout his life, but selling cars was the first thing that he truly loved, and he was really good at it. Henry had an effortless charm and a sort of unthreatening quality that made people trust him. He enjoyed talking to strangers, and he had no plans of slowing down or retiring. Growing up in the Great Depression had imprinted on him a set of unshakable values. He believed that you should work hard, save every dime you convinced, and treat every day like it's your last. And that mindset had served him well over the years. But life still had come with plenty of setbacks. 2 decades ago, his marriage had fallen apart, and so he'd appended his life and moved from California to Florida. Finding a new job there had been easy with Henry's sales experience, but he had not expected to find love again. He'd met his current girlfriend, Janet Scott, a little over 6 years earlier when Janet had come into Henry's dealership looking to buy a car. She'd left with the car and also with Henry's phone number. Their relationship quickly progressed from friendly dinners to romance, and Janet never seemed to mind that she was 26 years younger than Henry. She laughed at his jokes, loved his cooking, and put up with his constant car talk. Janet was also a salesperson in her own way. She worked at the Hallmark store at the Sarasota Square Mall, selling cards, chocolates, and stuffed animals. And that day, while Henry was getting ready to sell his third car, Janet was helping a shopper pick out a condolences card for a funeral. As she pulled different options from the rack, Janet couldn't help but feel a twinge of heartache. It was not that long ago that her own mailbox had been flooded with cards like these. Just before she met Henry, her husband, Ro, had died from a heart attack. Janet still wore the diamond engagement ring that Ro had given her, right next to the inexpensive topaz one that Henry had gotten her a few years earlier. She was comfortable in her relationship with Henry, but she knew not to expect a wedding ring from him. Henry had never actually gotten around to filing divorce paperwork for his first marriage, so he was still legally married to his ex in California. And they had 2 adult kids together, a son and a daughter. But Henry hardly ever spoke to his kids these days, which made Janet sad. She'd seen the same thing happen to her late husband. Ro had had an adult daughter from a former marriage, and they'd grown distant after Ro married Janet. Janet thought that Ro had regretted not repairing that relationship before he died, and so she didn't want Henry to die without getting a chance to patch things up with his kids. But she wasn't sure how to help him do that. As upbeat and charming as Henry was, he could also be very private and stuck in his ways. But Janet took a last look at the condolence card her customer chose and resolved to talk to Henry about his kids that night. After purchasing their card, the customer left and Janet began closing up the store. 20 minutes later, she was driving past sandy white beaches teeming with senior citizens. Sarasota was a magnet for people like Henry looking to spend their twilight years in the Florida sun. Pretty soon, Janet reached the peaceful neighborhood of Mirror Lake. Janet's spacious one-story house was at the very end of the road, with a red back door looking out to the water. Her late husband, Roe, had lived there with his first family before he met Janet. And then Janet lived there throughout their marriage and she inherited the place when Roe died. Now, because Roe literally had died in this house, initially Janet felt hesitant about the idea of letting Henry move in. But Henry had eventually sold her on the idea of him moving in by pointing out how much money they would save if he gave up his apartment. And so he moved in. When Janet walked in the door, she was immediately hit with a delicious smell wafting in from the kitchen. She smiled as she watched Henry move about the kitchen, dashing over for a kiss before hurrying back to the oven. Any discomfort that she might have felt about Henry living here in Roe's old house clearly was not shared. Henry had made himself right at home. After dinner, Janet cuddled on the couch with Henry and her dog, Kissy, while they watched some local news. And then, around 11:00 p.m., she remembered her plan to talk to Henry about his kids. But when she looked over at Henry, she could see he was already drifting off to sleep. So Janet switched off the TV and sent her fiancé to bed. The conversation could wait. Janet took Kissy out to the backyard for a quick walk, and then, after coming back inside, she headed to their bedroom where she removed her rings and set them on the nightstand before climbing into bed beside Henry. The next thing Janet knew, she was dragged from sleep by this blinding pain. And then her surprise gave way to terror when she realized someone was sitting on top of her, pinning her to the bed with their knees while twisting at her neck. Janet started to scream and thrash, but her attacker just punched her repeatedly in the head and chest. Janet tasted blood and started to black out, but she kept struggling, trying to get free. And suddenly, she and her attacker fell off the bed and hit the floor. But before she could get back to her feet, she felt a pull on her legs, and her attacker was right back on top of her, squeezing at her throat. Janet made a final attempt to push her attacker off, but by this point she was exhausted and disoriented, and slowly everything went black. Sometime later, Janet woke up on her bedroom floor. Her temple and her throat throbbed with pain, but her attacker was gone. At least they weren't on top of her anymore, and she couldn't see anybody else in the room. Janet lifted her head, trying her best to ignore the pain. She couldn't see much, since it was pitch black in the room and one of her eyes was swollen shut. But as she sat up, Janet heard something, a hoarse, raspy, wheezing sound. She didn't know where the sound was coming from or what it could be. All she knew was she needed to get away right now. Painfully, she got up and fumbled through the dark until she found the landline phone on the small vanity table. She picked it up to call the police, but the line was dead. And so, Janet left the phone and staggered down the hall and went out the back door. And from there, she headed over to her neighbor's home. When she got there, she desperately banged on the door until her neighbor, a woman named Kathy Peters, answered. And when the neighbor, Kathy, looked out and saw Janet standing there with her shattered face, she was so surprised that she immediately jumped backwards in fright. Janet was actually so bruised and bloody that Kathy did not recognize her at first. But when she realized who was standing there, she pulled Janet inside, locked the door, and ran to call 911. An ambulance arrived within minutes to take Janet to the hospital, and not a moment too soon. Even as the EMT loaded her onto the stretcher, she was already losing consciousness again. At almost the same time, several sheriff's deputies arrived at Janet's house. They found the back door unlocked, and so they headed inside. The moment they entered the master bedroom, the deputies knew there had been an extremely violent attack here. Drawers had been pulled from the dresser and dumped all over the floor. There was blood spatter on the blinds and all over the sheets, and a thick puddle of blood was on the floor right where Janet fell. And there, lying on the bed, was Henry. His face was covered in blood, and he had a belt cinched tightly around his neck. The deputies checked him for a pulse, but the man was obviously dead from strangulation. After discovering Henry's body, the deputies began searching the room. One of the deputies was down on his hands and knees, peering under the bed when he got startled by a pair of eyes staring back at him. It was Janet's dog, Kissy, cowering under the bed, shaking in terror. She refused to come out when the deputy called to her, so he crawled under and pulled her out. Once the deputy had the dog in his arms, it became clear that Kissy was not just terrified. Her eyes were dilated like she had a concussion, and there was some blood around her head, suggesting she had been beaten too. One of the deputies volunteered to take Kissy to a local pet hospital, and as he was leaving with the dog, another car pulled up and the men got out. They were Mark Brewer and Keith Muncy, detectives from the Sarasota Police Homicide Division, who would now be taking lead on the case. The two detectives headed inside to join the deputies, who quickly brought them up to speed. Right away, they were struck by the brutality of Henry's murder. He'd been strangled to death with his own belt while he was sleeping, and he'd also been badly beaten. The sheer violence that must have been involved here gave this crime a very personal feeling. The detectives also noticed that while the bedroom had been ransacked, it didn't seem like anything had been taken. For example, Henry's wallet with some money and credit cards in it was just out on a dresser. And so this made the detectives think that this probably was not a robbery. Next, they checked the landline phone, which was still lying off the hook where Janet had dropped it. The line was dead. So Detective Muncy headed out to the backyard, where he confirmed that the phone lines had been cut. He was heading back inside when a flash of white on the ground caught his eye. It was a cigarette butt lying at the edge of the property. And while the grass was wet from some light rain earlier that night, this cigarette butt was dry, meaning it had been dropped within the last few hours. Muncy went inside to share this discovery with Detective Brewer. And after doing so, it would turn out Brewer also had some news of his own. He had found the fingertip of a latex glove in the bedroom. The detectives now had the pieces of evidence that might have the killer's fingerprints or DNA material on them. But the lab was backed up, and so testing these items would take time. And so they were hoping that, long before they needed the results of those tests, their eyewitnesses could actually just help them solve the crime. So they headed to the hospital to interview the one person, aside from the killer, who was there when Henry was murdered, Janet. Unfortunately, though, when they arrived at the hospital, Janet was unconscious again. And also, one of the doctors warned that with the extent of the injuries she'd sustained, she could actually die. And so, Brewer and Muncy were suddenly facing the possibility of a double murder. They asked the hospital staff to call them if Janet woke up. In the meantime, the detectives began digging into Henry's life to try and understand why someone had wanted to kill him. When they got access to his bank accounts, they were surprised by just how much money Henry had put away. Henry sort of gave off the vibe that he was a senior citizen on a limited, fixed budget, but in reality, he had $700,000 in the bank. So the detectives speculated that maybe Henry was killed for his money, and their thoughts immediately turned toward Henry's relatives, who were most likely to gain financially from his death. The detectives learned that Henry did not have a will, but that only meant that the bulk of the inheritance would be divided between his adult children, Jeff and Sharon Caneva. When the detectives reached out to Jeff and Sharon, they learned that they were actually already on their way to Sarasota after learning their father had been killed. And at the detectives' request, they agreed to stop by the station to answer some questions. Brewer and Muncy knew it was impossible for Jeff or Sharon to have been present for the murder, since they were across the country in California when it happened. But that did not stop them from potentially arranging a hit through a third party. The detectives pressed the siblings about how they got along with their father, and both Jeff and Sharon said they were on good terms with Henry, but they didn't really talk to him very much. Not because they didn't want to. Jeff clearly idolized his father and had even followed in his father's footsteps to become a car salesman. But they said their father liked his privacy and didn't want many visitors. He seemed happy with the new life he built in Florida, so they tried to give him space and let him be. But then Jeff dropped some truly shocking information. A few months earlier, he had called his father at home, and a young man had answered. When Jeff asked who he was talking to, the man said he was Henry's son. Jeff was initially stunned and very confused because he believed he was Henry's only son. But eventually the truth came out. Soon after Henry had separated from Jeff and Sharon's mother and moved to Florida, he was in a very brief relationship with a woman who gave birth to Henry's other son, David. But Henry never told anybody about David, and Henry himself didn't even meet him until David had grown up and tracked him down. But from what Jeff was able to gather, it seemed like Henry and his son David had seen a lot of each other in the months leading up to the murder. It stung more than Jeff liked to admit, both because Henry had kept David's existence a secret and because he'd been so unavailable to his other kids. Following the conversation with Jeff and his sister, Sharon, detectives Brewer and Muncie got to work tracking David down. They learned that he was 20 years old and lived about 3 hours away in the Daytona Beach area. When they contacted him, he agreed to come down to Sarasota for questioning. And during his interview, he admitted that he knew Henry had a lot of money, but didn't know how much or if Henry had a will. David confirmed that he had been spending more time with Henry recently, and that some of the visits had taken place at the house in Mirror Lake where the murder took place. Most recently, David said he and Henry had watched sports together on TV on Father's Day, which happened to be just 4 days before Henry was killed. All these details made the detective suspicious of David. After all those years without seeing his father, David was, suddenly spending lots of time with him? Was he trying to get Henry's monies? Did he secretly nurse a deep grudge against Henry? Either way, David did know his way around Henry's home. And also David was a big man who'd be quite physically capable of strangling a sleeping 76-year-old. David's alibi for the night of the murder was also pretty weak. David told the detectives that he was with his girlfriend that night, and while she did confirm that was true, Brewer and Muncie knew she could just be lying for him. So ultimately, the detectives pressured David to take a polygraph test, and the results came back inconclusive. Now, of course, polygraph tests are not 100% accurate. I mean, people can lie and they can fake their answers, and a positive result could actually be a negative, and vice versa. But at a minimum, an inconclusive test meant that David remained very much a potential suspect. The detectives were still interested in Henry's other 2 children as well, and Henry's funeral, held about a week after the murder, gave the detectives a chance to observe all 3 kids together. And right away, Brewer and Muncie could see there was almost palpable tension between David, Jeff, and Sharon. And also, they could overhear very testy conversations between the siblings. At one point, David commented that he was looking forward to buying jet skis with his inheritance. This did not go over well with Jeff, who was already feeling very jealous about Henry spending his last Father's Day with David instead of him, and so he got angry and accused David of being involved in the murder. David walked away before the argument could go any further, and for the remainder of the funeral, the siblings basically avoided each other. The detectives agreed it was not that surprising that the siblings didn't get along. However, them not getting along did not necessarily mean they killed their father. But regardless, Brewer and Muncie decided to still keep an eye on all of Henry's children while they simultaneously dug into his other relationships. The following day, the detectives headed to the Toyota dealership where Henry worked to interview some of his colleagues. And one of Henry's buddies, a guy named Red, was more than happy to help. Reed said the other salesmen definitely respected Henry due to his long history in the business, but they also saw him as being pretty old-fashioned and would sometimes give him a hard time about being cheap. They couldn't understand why he wore old, ill-fitting clothes and drove a 10-year-old car when they knew he had money. It was common knowledge around the dealership that Henry had made more than the rest of them put together. Just from the number of cars Henry had sold, as one salesman put it, Henry had, quote, more money than God. The detectives jotted all this down and then asked Red if there was anyone on the staff who might have wanted to harm Henry. Red thought for a moment and then told them they should go talk to a guy named Mark. Red explained that Mark was a younger salesman who had worked at the dealership until recently. He was argumentative and lazy and would often miss work, sometimes disappearing for as much as a week at a time. Mark's laziness really rubbed Henry the wrong way, and at one point he had tried to talk some sense into Mark, but Mark just sort of blew him off. And soon after that, Mark was abruptly fired, just a few days before Henry's murder. Now, Reid didn't know if Henry had formally complained to management, which sort of led to Mark's firing. But Reid said, Henry had been vocal enough about his dislike of Mark that most of the other employees assumed that Henry must have had something to do with Mark's firing. The detectives interviewed more of the salesmen and heard similar stories. Some people thought Mark was actually a drug addict and that was why he disappeared sometime. And a few of the salesmen recounted that Mark had been looking for a gun right around the time he got fired. He had told them he needed it to, quote, take care of something. Armed with all these stories, Detectives Brewer and Muncie tracked down Mark and brought him into the Sarasota police station for questioning. Mark had a bad attitude right away and acted annoyed at them for wasting his time. While Mark said he did not know anything about Henry's murder, he also said that yes, he and Henry had butted heads. He said that Henry wanted to be treated like the dealership king simply because he'd been there the longest. Mark said that Henry was always butting into other people's business, and as far as Mark was concerned, Henry had gotten what he deserved. Naturally, Brewer and Muncie found this kind of talk extremely suspicious, so they pressed Mark harder. They told him that they'd found a latex glove fragment at the crime scene with fingerprints on it. Now, this was a total bluff on their part. They'd already analyzed that glove fragment, it was clean of prints. But Mark didn't know that, and if he was guilty, thinking that the police had hard evidence could make him cry. But instead, Mark responded somewhat sarcastically, saying that, yeah, finding that glove at the scene would make me a good suspect because my sister is a nurse, and so I have access to gloves just like that. The detectives thought this was a very strange thing to say, even if it was sarcastic. I mean, Mark was technically incriminating himself in a murder investigation. But Mark just did not seem to care. Brewer and Muncie just sat there trying to make sense of what Mark had just said when they got a call from the hospital. Janet was awake, and it looked like she was going to survive. And while she was still weak and in a lot of pain, she had said she was ready to answer their questions. The detectives were so eager to hear from her that they let Mark go for the moment and raced over to the hospital. But when they finally sat down with Janet, it became clear she was not going to be as helpful as they'd hoped to. Janet was not just beaten up. She was severely traumatized and confused about what had happened. Doctors said the first thing that she had asked when she regained consciousness was, "Where's Henry?" When Brewer and Muncie gently pressed her to try to focus and remember any details, she tried, but then suddenly got this crushing headache and had to stop. And then a couple of minutes later, when her headache kind of faded, she told them that all she could remember was being beaten and strangled by this faceless dark figure. And then a little bit after that, she remembered waking up on the ground hearing this horrible rattling, wheezing sound. To help jog her memory, Brewer showed Janet some crime scene photos of the bedroom that were taken after the attack. Janet looked closely at all the pictures, but still she just could not remember anything else. However, she did notice something in one of the photos. Her two rings that she had placed on the nightstand were missing. And so at this point, the detectives knew that perhaps the stolen rings indicated that this was a robbery after all. Maybe the killer was planning to take more but got spooked by the dogs barking and ran. But, on the other hand, the fact that just these rings appeared to be missing and that they had sentimental value could point to a personal connection between the killer and the victims. As important as Janet's realization about the rings was, it didn't really provide the detectives with any new clear answers. Their investigation so far had turned up some strong suspects, including Mark, the shady car salesman, and the three Caneva children, Jeff, Sharon, and their half-brother David. But as it stood, police did not have enough evidence to build a case against any one of them. So all the detectives could do now was just keep an eye on the suspects and hope that Janet's memory improved. But weeks and then months passed with no progress in the case or any change to Janet's memory, and so the investigation began to go cold. Then, in December of 1997, a full 6 months after Henry's murder, a clue dropped into the detectives' laps that changed everything. In a seemingly unrelated case, Sarasota police deputies responded to a domestic violence call at another house on Mirror Lake, across the water from Janet's place. This was not the first time they had to break up a fight at this home. A few months earlier, 39-year-old John Whiteley had pinned his girlfriend, 40-year-old Leila Hodges, between the washing machine and the wall, trapping her there. Leela had forgiven him for that incident, but now he'd attacked her again. And as the police once again separated the couple, John got the impression that he was about to be placed under arrest, and so he shouted that Leela had better keep her mouth shut and not accuse him of anything, or else he would tell them about the rings. Then, as if to prove he wasn't bluffing, he shouted to the deputies, "Hey, you guys want to know something about a murder?" Now, at this point, after John had said all this stuff, the deputies were all thinking of the same thing, Henry's murder case. Now, they all knew that two rings had been taken from a crime scene, but that detail had never been made public, which meant this couple, specifically John, might actually know something about Henry's murder. As soon as Detective Brewer and Muncie got word about John and Leela, they were convinced the couple must have had something to do with Henry's murder. They just couldn't figure out how John and Leela were connected to him. So out of desperation, they decided to go back and talk to Janet one last time. Unfortunately, Janet still could not remember anything more about the attack, so Brewer and Muncie came up with an idea. They were going to try to hypnotize her. It was unorthodox, but at this point they were willing to try anything, and Janet was on board. So the next day the detectives returned, now with a hypnotist who put Janet into a trance. And then while she was in her trance, they asked her a series of questions designed to draw out her repressed memories from the attack. And suddenly it was like Janet could hear and see things from the night of the attack that she hadn't been able to before. Finally, when the hypnotist asked her to describe her attacker, Janet grew quiet. She still could not picture their face, but she did remember something else. Under hypnosis, Janet recalled waking up to find a large shadowy figure sitting on her thighs while violently grabbing her neck. Janet tried to fight, but it didn't do any good. Then, as the killer continued to throttle her, she became aware of another set of hands on her shoulders. A second person that she couldn't see was holding her to the ground. That meant there were two attackers in the bedroom that night, not just one. Janet's revelation stunned the detectives at first, but they quickly realized several of their suspects came in pairs. The first pair was Henry's first set of kids, Jeff and Sharon. They stood to benefit the most from Henry's death as they knew they would inherit a portion of his small fortune. But that also applied to David, Jeff and Sharon's 20-year-old half-brother. David's girlfriend had provided him with an alibi. Now the detectives wondered if maybe she'd help David commit the crime, thinking his inheritance would benefit her too, making David and her a pair. The third set of suspects was John and Leela, the couple from the domestic abuse call. While they didn't seem to have a motive, or even really a connection, they lived nearby and seemed to know information that was not shared with the public. The only suspect who did not come with a potential accomplice was Mark, the salesman who was fired days before the murder. While it was still possible that he had killed Henry over a grudge, or maybe as part of a robbery, the detectives still had no idea who he would have worked with. That night after leaving the hospital, Brewer and Muncie holed up in their office and read through the files for each set of suspects, searching for any detail they might have missed. And they were starting to lose steam when Muncie stumbled upon something that made him pause. It was a single word buried in one of the suspects' files. Muncie showed it to Brewer, who immediately jumped to his computer to pull up more details on that suspect. And as his screen filled with information, everything began to fall into place. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Henry, Canavia, and Janet's caught on the night of June 20th, 1997. A little before 3:00 a.m., the figures crept along the bank of Mirror Lake. They were wearing black clothes and latex gloves, and the leader was smoking a cigarette. As they reached the edge of Janet's property, the leader put out the cigarette and dropped it into the wet grass. Then the pair hurried across the lawn to the house, where the leader used pliers to cut the phone line that was running along the exterior wall. They found the back door was unlocked, so they slipped inside. Once inside, the accomplice led the way to the master bedroom, where they found Henry and Janet fast asleep in bed. But the couple was not alone. Janet's dog, Kissy, was lying at her feet when the killers entered. The dog jumped off the bed and began barking. The accomplice stepped forward and delivered a powerful kick that sent Kissy flying against the wall. She fell down and went limp. The killers quickly glanced back over at the bed, and they were relieved to see that Janet and Henry were still asleep, so they moved ahead with their plan. The leader found a pair of pants on the floor, pulled out the leather belt, and then climbed on top of Henry. As Henry began to stir, the leader struck him several times in the face and then wrapped the belt around his neck and began to pull it tight. At the same time, the accomplice jumped on top of Janet and straddled her and began to beat her. Janet woke up and screamed and began fighting as hard as she could to get free. And one of Janet's wild punches caught the accomplice in the nose, causing them to reel back in surprise. And as a result, the accomplice and Janet both tumbled out of the bed onto the floor. By this point, the leader had finished with Henry, so they climbed off the bed and rushed around to help the accomplice. Together, they grabbed Janet and pinned her down, and then the leader climbed on top of her. Then the leader struck her several more times and then wrapped their hands around her neck and squeezed. The leader felt Janet go limp, at which point they said that should do it. As they climbed off of her, the killers looked at their handiwork and turned to go. On their way out, though, the accomplice spotted Janet's rings sitting on the nightstand, and they recognized one of the rings in an instant. And the sight of it made them furious, so the accomplice impulsively grabbed both rings and stuffed them into their pocket, then turned and dashed out of the room along with the leader. The killers had only been gone a few minutes when Janet regained consciousness. Feeling excruciating pain across her body, she could hear this strange, horrible rattling hiss and didn't know what it could denote. Even as she lay there, her mind was already struggling to bury the horrible trauma she had just experienced. That's why she didn't remember until her hypnosis session that she'd actually been attacked by two people, and that one of them was actually somebody that she knew. It would turn out the killers were John Whiteley and Leila Hodges, the couple from the domestic abuse call. And just as Brewer and Muncie had suspected, these two did have a personal connection to the victims. However, the connection was not really to Henry. It was to Janet. When the detectives reviewed their case file, that single word that stuck out to them was Leila's maiden name. Leila had been married several times and had taken multiple last names, but she'd been born Leila Scott. She was no stranger to Janet. She was Janet Scott's stepdaughter. Leila was the daughter of Janet's late husband, Roe, from his first marriage. She grew up in the house on Mirror Lake where Janet and Henry lived together, and she hated them because she always thought that house should have gone to her when Hurd had died. Leila felt similarly about Janet's diamond ring. It was the same ring her father had given to his first wife, Leila's mother, which means all along the detectives were wrong about their most basic assumption. Henry was not the primary target of the attack. Janet was. And Leila's deep hatred of Janet explained the brutality of the attack. As a small older man, Henry didn't stand a chance, and Janet was lucky to be alive. She was beaten and choked so badly that her larynx was crushed. That horrible wheezing hiss she heard when she woke up on the floor, that was her own labored breathing. Once Detective Brewer and Muncie put this all together, they had John and Leila arrested. John's DNA was tested and it matched the DNA found on the cigarette, but that was at the crime scene. The leader during the actual attack itself was John, and Leila was the accomplice. However, the true mastermind behind this attack was Leila. The couple took a plea deal and received a sentence of 20 years. As for Janet Scott, her physical and psychological trauma persisted for much longer than 20 years. Her voice and eyesight never completely returned to full strength. Fortunately, though, her beloved dog, Kissy, would make a full recovery and lived a long, happy life. Today's podcast will feature 3 unbelievable true stories. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Third Eyewitness, and it's about a woman who makes a grim discovery in a remote canyon. The second story you'll hear is called The Burning Question, and it's about a house fire that leaves a mother devastated. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Who Said That, and it's about a car crash rescue that has a wild ending. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time you're over at the Amazon Music Follow Button's house, sneak into their closet and replace all of their shoe insoles with pudding skins. Okay, let's get into our first story called Third Eyewitness. On the morning of December 21st, 1980, a woman in her 40s walked into a jail cell in Los Angeles, California. Now, in this jail cell already was another inmate. Her name was Ida Louise Smith. She was 32 years old, and at the time, she was laying on one of the benches inside of the cell. Ida had actually been in jail for 4 days leading up to this moment. The police were sure Ida had something to do with the savage murder of a nurse in the area, but they really didn't understand what role she had played. In fact, virtually everything about Ida was very confusing to police, and Ida herself was not really doing herself any favors because she wasn't really explaining how she had the information that she had the information that she had the information. Now, Ida had already gone through a 10-hour-long interrogation which led police nowhere. She had undergone a polygraph test which didn't lead to any new answers, and she had also undergone a thorough strip search. She had been kept without food for 24 hours. At one point, she had been left in this cold jail cell without shoes for 4 days, but she just wouldn't crack. She would not confess to playing a role in this murder, and so this was why police on this day had decided to go another route to get information out of Ida. That woman in her 40s who had just walked into Ida's jail cell was pretending to be an inmate, but in reality, she was an undercover cop, and her job was to go into this jail cell, befriend Ida when her at rust, and see if maybe then Ida would begin revealing information about what she had done. And so, after this undercover cop walked into the jail cell, the jailer shut the door behind them, closing in the undercover cop and Ida. And at this point, Ida was woken up by the noise, and she sat up on her bench and she looked over at the undercover cop. And the cop, she was immediately struck by Ida's appearance. Ida did not look like a murderer. She was this little, slight, totally unthreatening person who really just looked like a suburban mom who maybe had a white-collar job. But the undercover cop also knew that appearing to be totally harmless was a great cover for being a murderer, and so this could all totally be an act. And also, to this undercover cop, it just seemed like Ida was way too calm and collected given her circumstances. She's effectively wanted for murder, and the police are putting so much pressure on her to get her to speak about it. And she's just laying down sleeping in her cell, making no big deal about it. But the undercover cop maintained a very neutral persona, and she sat down and, at some point, she asked Ida, hey, what are you in here for? And Ida, she kind of just looked down and smiled for a second. And then when she looked back up at the undercover cop, she said, you're never gonna believe me. The undercover cop at this said, oh, come on, how bad could it be? Tell me what's going on here. Why are you in here? And it was at this point that Ida would say something that nearly caused the cop to break character, because Ida, she would say, well, I'm pretty sure this is gonna be a movie. Now, the undercover police officer tried to be as neutral as possible as she's hearing this, but in her mind she's like, okay, I clearly just discovered Ida's motive for being involved in this murder. Ida wants to be famous. She wants this made into a movie where she's the star. At the same time this conversation was happening, in an office within the jailhouse, a police captain was listening in on the conversation between Ida and this undercover cop. And when he listened to Ida talk about wanting to turn her story into a movie, he just shook his head in disgust because Ida had just brought police to the location of the body of 31-year-old Melanie Uribe, a local nurse who was robbed and savagely beaten to death and then dumped in a canyon behind a bush. And now Uribe was talking about how she could get publicity around this terrible, horrible crime. It just did not sit right with the captain. And so, as the captain was sitting there kind of watching this conversation transpire between the undercover cop and Ida, the captain was beginning to form a theory of what actually happened to Melanie Uribe and how Ida played a role in her murder. His theory went like this: 6 days earlier, the victim, Melanie Uribe, had left for her shift at the hospital in Burbank, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, but she had never arrived for her shift. And so, when her colleagues had noticed her absence, eventually the police work all into search was launched to find her. But after 48 hours, the police had not found Melanie, and there were no signs as to what happened to her. She had just vanished. And it was at that point, 2 days after Melanie had gone missing, that Ida just showed up at the police station and said she knew where Melanie was. And so, the detective who was talking to Ida at the time, when she came in on said this, he brought out a map and he said, "Okay, point to where she is." And Ida had immediately pointed to this area on the map called Lopez Canyon, which was about 25 miles away from Los Angeles. And she would tell the detective that, yeah, Melanie is somewhere right in there. When the detective asked Ida, "How do you know this?" Ida would say she just knew. And then when the detective followed up and said, "Ida, this is pretty incriminating that you're telling me where someone's body is. What's motivating you to come and say this to me?" And Ida would say that her conscience was weighing on her terribly, and she just had to go to police. Now, the detective who talked to Ida when she first came into the police station really didn't know what to make of Ida, because she looked so unthreatening. And what she was saying, she was saying with a lot of confidence, and it seemed like she was really eager to help the investigation versus just clearing her conscience, which is kind of what she said she was doing. And when the detective looked into who Ida was, he discovered that she had a great job. She worked at an aerospace company in Burbank, California, and she even had governmental clearance. And so, this woman clearly has been vetted by the government and by high-level companies, and she's passed the tests. But at the same time, the detective knew there was no good reason for why Ida would have this information: the location of a dead body. I mean, either she's just wrong and there is no body there, or if the body's there, the most likely scenario is that Ida was involved in killing this person or disposing of their body, or maybe both. So the detective said to Ida, "Hey, come back tomorrow and we'll take a police helicopter. We'll fly out over the canyon and we'll see if we can find Melanie's body together." And so Ida said, "Okay, sounds good." She turned and she left. But then, just an hour later, Ida came back into the police station with her two young kids in the car, and she would tell the detective that she actually just drove out with her kids to that canyon and had found Melanie's body. In fact, she told the detective that her 7-year-old child, who was in the car right now, had been the one to actually find Melanie's body. The detective could not believe this woman, one, had gone out by herself to do this, but two, had brought along her kids as well. Like, what's going on with this person? But regardless of how weird this was, the detective immediately rounded up some backup, and with Ida's help, they went out to a particular spot in this canyon. And sure enough, when they got out there, right in the spot where Ida said it would be, was Melanie's badly beaten body. And so it was at this point that the police captain had grabbed Ida and said, "You're under arrest. I'm putting you in a cell because there's no way you could have known about this unless you were somehow involved." The captain thought by putting Ida in jail for a couple of days, she'd get scared and start talking. But 4 days had gone by and Ida had not cracked. She had not given up anything beyond telling the undercover police officer that she thought her story, that was kind of still developing, would likely be turned into a movie. And so, the captain really didn't know what to do because, at this point, Ida had not actually committed a crime. It was not a crime to find a dead person's body and report it to the police, and there was no evidence that actually tied Ida to the murder. All the police had was the fact that Ida came to them and told them that she knew where the body was, and then they actually found the body was. But that's all they had. But the police captain would catch a break on that 4th day because he would receive a phone call that would totally change everything about this case. It would turn out on December 17th, 1983, so the same day that Ida would go into the police station to report that she knew where Melanie Uribe's body was. Well, on that day, Ida was at work listening to the radio and filing some paperwork. And as Ida listened to the radio, the local newscaster was talking about Melanie Uribe and how she was missing. And the newscaster talked about how police had found her truck and it was parked on this dead-end street, and that police were searching nearby residences to see if maybe they knew what happened to Melanie. But as of right now, there really were no new leads. They did not know where Melanie was. And it was right around this point that Ida's listening to the news about Melanie that Ida heard a voice in the room. She was in the room, and the voice said very clearly to Ida, "She's not in one of those houses." And Ida, immediately when she heard it, She turned around wondering who the heck was in here, who's talking to her. But there was nobody else in the room. And then, it was like immediately, there were these flashes of images in Ida's brain that she had no idea what they meant, but it was a succession of a dirt road and then a bush and then something white, a nurse's shoe. And Ida very clearly saw these three images. And it was right then that Ida thought, I know where Melanie Uribe is. And so she sat there wondering what to do, and then finally thought, I have to go to police, as crazy as this sounds. And so she hopped in the car and she drove to the police station and she said, I don't know how, but I do know Melanie Uribe is right there in that canyon. But when the police had said, come back tomorrow and we'll go out and look for her, Ida just couldn't wait. And so she had gone with her kids, driven out to the canyon that she had seen in her mind. And sure enough, when she got out there, she found the dirt road that she had seen, then she found the bush that she had seen. And then, with the help of her kids, they found the white nurse's shoe, and it was right near Melanie's body, which meant that voice that Ida heard in the vision, she had all been real. The phone call that the police captain received on the fourth day that Ida was sitting in jail and talking to the undercover cop. The phone call that changed the whole case, well, the phone call was from another police officer saying they had just arrested 3 men who were caught bragging about beating and killing Melanie Uribe, and they had confessed, and they were now being held in jail. And so, clearly, Ida did not commit this murder. And so, even though it made no sense that she just knew where this body was, the police had to release Ida the same day. So, she was released, and then, ultimately, the 3 men who confessed to killing Melanie Uribe, they would be found guilty and they would each be sentenced to life in prison. 6 years later, Ida would sue the police department and she would win the lawsuit because the jury on that case absolutely believed that Ida really did have a psychic vision. That led to the discovery of Melanie's body. Ida would never go on to make a movie about her story, and in fact, when she was asked later on about why, she said that during her conversations with that undercover cop, Ida would clarify that she didn't say that she wanted to make a movie, but rather she said to the undercover cop something to the effect of, it feels like I'm letting out a bad movie. So that was kind of misconstrued by police into her saying, I want to make a movie about this. She didn't and has never made a movie, and in no way has sought out any fame or recognition for what happened. Our next story is called The Burning Question. On the afternoon of December 15th, 1997, a brand new mother named Luz QRV is sat on her couch in her little apartment in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, cradling her beautiful 10-day-old baby girl, who she had named De La Marvera. And in the room with Luz and her daughter were some members of Luz's extended family who had come over to meet the baby. And so for about an hour, the family all took turns, holding the baby and complimenting how cute her little dimples looked. And then eventually, the baby started to get fussy, at which point Luz said she was going to take her upstairs and put her to bed. And so Luz brought De La Mar upstairs to her nursery, and she put the baby down in her crib. And she stayed with her for a bit until De La Mar finally had kind of dozed off to sleep. And so, after being sure that her daughter wasn't going to stir, Luz got up and she began making her way towards the door. And right before she left, she made sure to plug in the space heater for her daughter's room to make sure it would stay warm enough while her daughter slept. And then after that, she left the room, shut the nursery door, and went back downstairs to rejoin her family. Luz's family didn't stick around much longer after Luz came downstairs. And after they were all gone, Luz realized she was totally exhausted, and her daughter was still fast asleep upstairs. And so Luz decided she would also lie down and try to take a nap herself. But as soon as she closed her eyes, she heard this loud thud sound coming from the second floor. And it sounded like something really heavy had smashed into the ground. And she's thinking, her daughter's up there. Could that be her daughter somehow falling out of the crib or something? And so Luz jumped up, sprinted upstairs, and as she looked down the hall, she could clearly see there was black smoke billowing out of her daughter's nursery. And so Luz charges down the hall, she opens up the door, and she looks into her daughter's room, and it's completely engulfed in flames. I mean, everything is on fire, but it's her baby girl in there. And so without any hesitation, Luz charges into the inferno. But when she gets up to the crib, the crib is so completely on fire that when she looks in, she can't even see her daughter. And so in a craze, she begins looking around the room thinking maybe my daughter did fall out of the crib and she's somewhere else in the room. But everything is on fire. She can't see anything. And so as Luz is literally catching on fire and breathing in all the smoke, she's screaming for her daughter. And then a couple minutes later, firefighters burst into the door and they literally drag Luz out of the nursery. She hasn't found her daughter. She's screaming, where's my baby? The firefighters, they bring her outside, and just a couple of minutes later, they were able to extinguish this blaze. And after they came out of the house again, they found Luz, who had all these terrible burns on her body and she's totally messed up from this fire. And they tell her that, unfortunately, her daughter was dead. After DeLamar's death, Luz's life completely fell apart. I mean, the grief was so immense, it was like she could no longer function in society. I mean, she actually retracted from the world, stopped interacting with people, didn't see her family. She went up getting a divorce from her husband just over the grief and the sadness of losing this child. I mean, it was like her life basically ended when her daughter's life ended. But on top of that, Luz also felt this incredible sense of guilt because after the fire, the investigators told her that the cause of the fire, although not conclusive, was very likely from that space heater she had plugged in right before she had left the room. And so, of course, Luz is feeling this incredible burden for having potentially killed her daughter. But also, she just began to obsess over the details because, again, it wasn't conclusive that it was the space heater. That was their best guess as to what caused the fire. And so Luz began to wonder, was it something else? Was it preventable? What was it? Basically, Luz became completely obsessed with what happened to her daughter. It was like the only thing she ever thought of for years. Fast forward to January 24th, 2004, so 6 years after the fire, and on this day, Luz was invited to a family party. There was a get-together, and Luz basically never went to any family function or really left her house much at all. But for some reason on this day, she decided to go out. And so she goes to this party, and when she gets there, remember, Luz has basically been a recluse for the past 6 years, and so she's not gonna immediately start socializing. And so instead, she just goes in the house and kind of finds a spot in the back, kind of away from everybody else who's chatting, and just stands there kind of people watching. And as she's doing that, something catches her attention off to the side, and when she turns to look at it and sees what it is, she immediately just freezes. 3 days later, Luz walked into the office of a local state legislator, and after saying hello, she sat down, reached into her purse, and pulled out a little plastic bag that contained a folded-up napkin, and she slid it across the table to the legislator. So he picked up the bag and stared at it inquisitively as Luz dove into this wild explanation about what was in this bag and why she was here as she was. And at the end of this totally off-the-wall, insane-sounding story, the legislator was left just kind of staring at Luz and looking back at the bag in total shock. And then, finally, after a couple of moments of silence, the legislator just said, "Okay, yeah, I'll see what I can do." It would turn out the fire was not caused by the space heater that Luz had plugged in right before she left her daughter's room. Instead, police believe after Luz came downstairs and tried to take a nap, somebody broke into her apartment, went into the nursery, and set the fire on purpose, but not before abducting the baby, and that person was one of Luz's own family members who had been at her apartment the day celebrating the birth of DeLama Vera. It was Luz's husband's cousin, Carolyn Correa. And in fact, on this same day, before the fire and before the abduction, Carolyn made a point to announce to the whole family that she was pregnant, even though she wasn't. It was just going to be her cover story for why she suddenly had this brand new baby. 6 years later, when Luz was at that family party, well, the thing that caught her attention on the other side of the room was her daughter. She literally saw her daughter, and even though she hadn't seen her in 6 years, she instantly knew it was her because of her distinctive dimples. Now Luz knew she couldn't just suddenly yell out, "That's my daughter." So instead, she came up with this plan. She walked up to the girl and very discreetly said, "Hey honey, I think you got some gum in your hair." And so, as she pretended to pull gum out of the child's hair, she carefully plucked a few strands and put them inside of a napkin and put it inside of her pocket. And then 3 days later, she brought that hair inside of that plastic baggie and she gave it to the legislator and basically said, "Here's what I think happened. I think she stole my kid, you know. Can you test it for DNA to prove that girl is my daughter?" And the legislator was like, "Okay, I'll give it a shot." And lo and behold, that hair would prove that girl at the party was her daughter. She did not die in that fire. Carolyn Correa was sentenced to 9 to 30 years in prison for abduction. She originally had an arson charge against her as well, but investigators could not actually prove how the fire started, and so they ultimately dropped those charges. Officials also launched an inquiry into how the fire department had handled the original investigation, because Luz had tried to convince fire officials, you know, maybe her daughter had not died in the blaze, maybe she was just missing. Because when Luz went into the nursery, she claimed she couldn't even find her daughter. But investigators had told her that the fire had burned so hot that basically her daughter had been totally incinerated, and that's why she couldn't find her. In the end though, because of her refusal to ever give up, Luz was ultimately reunited with her daughter, Delamar. The next and final story of today's episode is called Who Said That? At 12:30 p.m. on March 7, 2015, a police officer named Tyler Beddoes, along with his partner, were driving in his police cruiser near the Spanish Fork River in Utah, when suddenly a police dispatcher came on over the radio. And this dispatcher was speaking very urgently and said, "Hey, a fisherman has just called in to say that he spotted what looks like an upturned SUV partially submerged in the Spanish Fork River right underneath a bridge. And whoever is closest to this bridge, get over there and see if there's anybody inside the vehicle that can be saved." And so Officer Beddoes and his partner, they knew they were very near this bridge, and so immediately they banged a U-turn. They drove to the bridge, but from the road, they looked down and couldn't see any SUV. But they saw there were some firefighters and paramedics that were also converging at the spot on the road, and everybody's getting out and running down to the riverbank. And so Beddoes and his partner did the same thing. They got out and they ran down. And then finally, when they got to the riverbank and they saw underneath this bridge, sure enough, there was this Reed SUV upturned, partially submerged. And he noticed right away that none of the doors had been opened in this SUV. And so it meant whoever was driving this vehicle when it flipped over very likely was still inside. And so Officer Beddoes and his partner and the other first responders just jumped into this icy cold river and began making their way closer and closer to this upturned SUV, which again, it's not fully submerged. It's like a third of the way underwater. So, if you were sitting in the seat inside of this vehicle and you were an adult, your head would basically be in the water if you were still strapped into the seat. And as they're making their way towards this SUV, when they got close enough, they began hearing a woman inside of the vehicle screaming, "Hey, we're in here and here. Come over here, help." But when Officer Beddoes and the rest of the first responders actually reached the SUV, the water was so murky and it basically completely covered up the windows that they weren't really able to look into the vehicle. They could just hear this woman yelling, but that was it. And then when they tried to open up the doors, they couldn't do it because the roof had begun to cave in, and so the actual framing of the door wouldn't open. And so all these first responders, it's like their adrenaline's pumping and they're like, "Come on, we gotta push this thing up onto its side so we can get in." And so all these first responders are pushing and pushing, and slowly but surely, they began to raise the side of this vehicle up until the windows suddenly were clear. And Officer Beddoes and the others were able to look into the car, and they saw there was a woman in the driver's seat and there was a baby in a car seat dangling upside down in the back seat, still strapped in the back seat. And so Beddoes began screaming, "There's a baby in here! There's a baby in here!" And suddenly it was like everybody got extra strength, and they pushed this vehicle all the way up onto its side. And then one of the firefighters climbed up onto the side of the car, which now was the highest point of the car. And he reached in, and he clipped the straps holding the baby, who had been upside down, angling there, cut the straps and pulled the baby out and handed the baby over to Officer Beddoes. And then the firefighter began doing the same thing to get the woman out. But Officer Beddoes at this point, he just took this baby. He turned away. He figured the first responders will handle this woman, and he's gonna take this baby to safety cause he couldn't even tell if the baby was alive or not. So he's cradling this baby, he's rushing back through the water back to the riverbank, and then he hands the baby over to the paramedics. And right as he does, he sees this little baby begins to move its arms and flicker its eyes. And he wanted to weep out of relief that this child was okay. They put the baby onto a stretcher, they put the baby in the ambulance, and they whisked the baby away to the hospital where this baby would survive. But after the baby had been taken away, Officer Beddoes turned his attention back to the SUV and back to the woman to see how she was doing. But he could tell right away from the way people were acting, all the other first responders that were still dealing with the crisis in the water, the way they were acting indicated that something is off here. Well, it would turn out 14 hours earlier, so at around 10:00 p.m. the previous night, a 28-year-old woman named Jennifer Goer Esbeck had just left her father's house in Salem, Utah. And in her car was her little 18-month-old baby Lily, who was in the back seat. And after Jennifer pulled away from her father's house, and her father's on the porch waving to her, she began driving towards her home. But something happened around 10:30 p.m. that night. We don't know what, but something caused Jennifer to careen off the road on that bridge and flip over and land in the water. Maybe she fell asleep at the wheel or an animal jumped out. We don't know. But we know at 10:30, she careens off the bridge and she lands in that river. And then for 14 hours, she and her baby remained upside down in that river until finally Officer Beddoes and the other first responders came rushing over to open it up and get them out of there. And if you recall, all the first responders, Officer Beddoes included, heard Jennifer screaming that they were in the car, "Come save us, please." But what they would find out is that could not have been Jennifer, because Jennifer was killed on impact when the car fell into the water. Only Lily survived the crash. And then Lily, who's nearly hypothermic and she's upside down with water like 2 inches away from her head, for 14 hours she dangled there. And when she was pulled out, according to doctors, it was like a couple of minutes before she would have died from hypothermia. And so without that voice, Lily almost certainly would have died, because it was the sound of that voice that really encouraged all these first responders to find the strength and get that car up on its side and then get the baby out of there. We don't know whose voice that belonged to, but for sure it saved Lily's life. And again, baby Lily would make a full recovery. And to this day, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders, they know what they heard, and they do not have an explanation for it. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved. And some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.